The 13th Legion, later to be known as the Ultramarines, traces its origins all the way back to the final years of the Unification War on Terra. During this critical period, the Emperor's plan for the creation of the Legions Astartes began to take shape, and the legions themselves began to differentiate. The formation of the Ultramarines, like that of their fellow legionaries, was marked by a critical testing phase, known as Alpha Intake, in which several thousand warriors were raised to assess the stability and adaptability of the Legion's gene seed. This intake proved to be a rather glowing success, with the gene seed exhibiting no notable physical mutations beyond the expected norms, and all organs were found to be functional and fully operational. However, the results of the Alpha Intake were more than just biologically sound. The psychological profiles of this first generation of warriors revealed significant traits that would later define the Ultramarines for millennia to come. There was an increase of aggression which was anticipated, much like the other legions. However, instead, these initiates displayed a particular tendency towards cohesion, hierarchy, and an almost obsessive dedication to their assigned goals, compared to other early legions. The Ultramarines showed fewer individualistic, fractious tendencies within the Legion itself, which would later be a large part of how the Legion was organized. Much of the 13th's early history remains shrouded in no small amount of secrecy, often obscured in layers of impervious confidentiality surrounding the Emperor's genetic experiments, and a large majority of their records being lost during the Siege of Terra. However, through piecing together surviving fragments of information, a clearer picture emerges, one where the Ultramarines' early expansion beyond the testing stage showed that recruitment was rather wide-ranging, pulling from various cultures and regions across all of Terra. Initiates came from diverse and often highly populated, formerly hostile areas. Panacoro, sub-equatorial Mavgan clans, along with the warlike families of the Sargon Enclave and the Madifreak Hive Oligarchy. Them, along with a significant assortment of other imperial citizens, were selected to become part of the 13th. Them, along with the anthropophagic tribes of the Caucasus Wastes, would quickly become integrated and loan their cultures to what would become the Ultramarines. Despite these groups' cultural differences, the gene seed allowed them to share many psychological traits. This is in large part because, despite the differences, these groups shared one key characteristic: resistance to the later stages of the Unification Wars. This resistance, however, was not subdued through diplomacy or negotiations. Instead, it was crushed through near total annihilation, leaving behind only scattered refugees and the orphaned remnants of the once thriving societies. It was this harsh process that led to the informal moniker of the 13th Legion, the Warborn. The psychological impact of the 13th gene seed may have also been deliberately manipulated to serve as a tool of terror, due to its strong panache to driving a unified group, which some feared was almost hive mind-like, reinforcing the unification's final stages and ensuring rebellious fractions would be bled dry of resistance. This genetic predisposition towards cohesion and hierarchy not only aided the Emperor's conquest of Terra, but also successfully absorbed the savage rebellious tribes of the Old Knight into his growing Imperium. It is easy to see that the Warborn were not simply created as warriors. They were designed specifically as instruments of subjugation, able to blend the fiercest cultures into usable materials for the Emperor's will. As the Unification Wars drew to a close, the legacies of the nascent Legions Astartes were already taking shape. Yet, curiously enough, the records of the 13th Legion's involvement in the final battles of Terra are often seen as conspicuously absent. Unlike the early incarnations of the 7th and the 8th, whom both fought in the bitter dregs of the Unification Wars, the Ultramarines' first recorded official battle honors stem from the first pacification of Luna and the brutal Senda campaign on the furthest reaches of the Sol system. This absence raises a lot of questions. Was the 13th deliberately withheld from the Terran-bound conflicts, and if so, to what end? As the Great Crusade began in its earnest, with its conquest of Segmentum Solar, humanity's most ancient and densely settled dominion, it seemed some remnants of the Dark Age of technology still clung to independence. Some welcomed the Imperium as a guiding force, seeking protection beneath its greater banner, while others, whether through ignorance or arrogance, resisted imperial compliance, believing their isolated strength was sufficient to defy the emperor's will. And then there were those who had long suffered under the dominion of the Xenos, their chains yet to be broken. Against all of these, the emperor unleashed the full might of his legions. At the time, the 13th Legion numbered around 8,000 astartes, which seems rather different than their later significantly larger numbers. Fighting under the emperor's direct generalship, they carved a reputation out for themselves, in particular through campaigns of planetary liberation and annihilation. This led to the Legion gaining the titles for the liberation of Denrus and the extermination of the Scorvidiana Xenos Empire. Beyond these grand campaigns, they conducted a series of independent compliance operations, securing worlds like Lorin Segma, Sekiel's Landing, and Nedabel. Each successful conquest was not only cementing their status as a rather disciplined and well-marshaled, effective fighting force, but also served another purpose, the expansion of their numbers. From the Warborn's Sons of Terra to the militant factions of the newly conquered human worlds, the 13th Legion steadily grew, drawing in recruits from amongst those they had subdued at a rather accelerated pace due to the stability of their gene seed. It was during this early period of the Great Crusade that the Emperor's grand design for the Legions Astartes became unshakably clear. Each legion was not simply built for war, but designated for a specific kind of war. While all were engineered to bring about victory on the battlefield, each possessed a distinct temperament and biological makeup, along with a particular inclination that set it apart. Some excelled in terror, others in shock assault or siegecraft. The 13th Legion were methodical and ruthless, emerging as a force that would not simply conquer worlds, but crush them in a way that allowed them to be governed properly, as they were designed to be harbingers of order and structure, in a way that would later define Ultramar itself. As the Legions Astartes continued to evolve and expand, the distinct temperaments of each legion would continue to manifest in greater and greater degrees, sometimes in overt, terrifying ways, but other times in more subtle, if not insidious form. The 9th Legion, at this time known as the Revenant Legion, but later recognized as the Blood Angels, had already begun displaying their near supernatural ferocity in battle. The 14th Legion, the Death Guard, exhibited a preternatural endurance that allowed them to grind their foes down with an impeccable amount of near incomparable resilience. The 8th Legion, the Night Lords, even before reuniting with the Primarch, had fallen into the grasp of darkness, as psychological warfare was not only a part of their combat doctrine, but apparently a fundamental part of their nature. Spreading terror and despair wherever they fought came as naturally as breathing. Meanwhile, the 10th Legion, the Iron Hands, were already gaining a rather notable renown for their cold, unyielding logic and their ever-growing affinity for war's technological aspects. The 13th Legion, however, did not belong to either of these extremes. Their strength lay in a balance between aggression and restraint, along with tactical flexibility that made them uniquely suited for joint operation tasks and cross-theater warfare. Unlike some of their more insular brother legions, the Ultramarines excelled in the integration of multiple forces, seamlessly coordinating between the Imperialis Auxilia and other Space Marine legions in order to achieve joint objectives. Whether commanding elite regiments of the Solar Auxilia and the storied Old 100, or bringing to heel disorganized and often rebellious hosts of the Imperialis Militia, the 13th Legion imposed discipline wherever they were, including places where others would have only found chaos. Where necessary, they did not hesitate to embed one of their own warriors in a near-permanent basis within these mortal formations, or allow themselves to serve for extended periods of time within deployment groups of other legions. This is something that many of the legions at the time would see as distasteful, yet the Ultramarines embraced them, understanding that order itself was a weapon that they could wield, and that fear and inspiration could be wielded effectively or to a greater effect than a bolter or a blade. In this, they were often compared to the 1st Legion, the Dark Angels, and the 16th Legion, the Luna Wolves, other forces that had mastered the art of war, not just through their superior strength, but through their strategic domination. The 13th Legion's combined arms doctrine was built on adaptation, rather than specializing in any one particular form of combat. While their foundational tenets of training had provided a rigid framework, they had quickly evolved, incorporating the strength of those they fought alongside with and against, from the knife-fighting precision of the Opaki gangs of Hive Core to the armed warfare doctrines of the Iron Hands. The Ultramarines absorbed every lesson of the battlefield they could when it was offered. It was this ability to learn, refine, and perfect that made them so deadly, not just as warriors, but as architects of war. By the time of the third solar decade of the Great Crusade, the 13th Legion, who would become later known as the Ultramarines, had firmly established a distinct and rather recognizable identity. Unlike some of its peers, the Ultramarines were known for their pragmatism and directness within battle. While other legions might have delved into the theoretical and esoteric aspects of warfare, the Ultramarines prioritized decisive action, honed through practical experience above all else. Their approach was simple: swift engagement, rapid achievement of tactical objectives, and later adapting the populace to imperial rule. These strategies were to be adapted based on the conditions at hand. This pragmatic disposition was reflected not only in their methods, but in their pride and honor, as they were fiercely loyal to the Imperium, taking great care to safeguard their reputation, along with frequently competing with their fellow legionaries in rivalries of achievement. This rivalry was especially prominent with those legions whose Primarchs had already emerged, and it marked a deeply rooted desire to prove their superiorities in the eyes of their peers. At the time, also known as the Warriors of the Brotherhood, the 13th Legion also began to distinguish itself visually, with symbolic displays marking their victories, but rather than adopting a singular overarching livery like the 3rd Legion, the Emperor's Children, or the 14th, known at the time as the Dusk Raiders, the Ultramarines' individual companies adopted distinctive markings in order to commemorate their personal achievements in particular campaigns. Their core livery in the tradition of their early campaigns would remain the same since the Senda campaign, being a stark gray and gunmetal coloring. However, significant victories were marked with unique additions to the base color. For instance, companies that fought alongside the 3rd Legion during the purgation of the Adhuman Corsairs in the Cornside Nebula were granted black gauntlets and midnight blue helms, and the ancient Terran weighing of scales, along with the Death Head's icon, symbols of judgment. This new heraldry would be emblazoned alongside their numerical Legion identifiers, which earned them the title of Nemesis, a name born of their pivotal victory. Similarly, the armed formations that had halted the Orc advance on the plains of Cryptamundi, thereby saving the lives of millions, marked their success with the emerald light of the Aurora Borealis that had split the skies over the battlefield. This visual homage was reflected in the right pauldron, forever marking their participation in this legendary defense. Despite these honors, the 13th Legion rejected any formal name for the Legion as a whole, as their first Lord Commander, Gren Gustulf, is famously recorded as saying, "I am told that once the numeral 13th was a token of an ill omen by the weak-minded and those enslaved by the lies of superstition. But in the Emperor's service, we shall make it a byword for redemption and glory." Yet for all its triumphs and growing legacy, the 13th Legion was about to face what would be its greatest challenge, a test of their martial will and their resolve, and a potential failure for their very methods of war, all being pushed to the utter limits. By 833 M30, the 13th Legion had undergone significant expansions, now numbering approximately 33,000 Space Marines. Their primary battle group was formed out of the 12th Expeditionary Fleet, and this was a formidable force that would soon be tested in one of the more pivotal events of the Great Crusade. This expansion was a result of two key factors that set the Ultramarines apart from their peers. The first was the Legion's pragmatic warfare doctrines, which allowed them to favor more attrition-heavy tactics, allowing the Ultramarines to survive longer and their forces to build up in higher numbers. The Ultramarines, as evidenced in their previous campaigns, were adept at achieving their objectives with minimal casualties. Their emphasis for precision strikes, coupled with their ability to avoid prolonged engagements, meant that they could often end battles quickly and decisively, reducing the toll on both their forces and civilians, meaning that they would have a wider base to recruit new astartes from. Unlike the other legions which reveled in the brutal and costly acts of warfare that they did, the Ultramarines excelled in efficiency and efficacy, and effectively achieving their goals with a singular precision. When engaging with human worlds, they took particular care to minimize collateral damage, maintaining their reputation as tacticians that valued the preservation of life over unnecessary destruction. The second was a unique aspect of the 13th gene seed, which contributed to their growing numbers. While the success rate of gene seed implantation of the 13th was standard, their gene line displayed an extraordinary resistance to errors, in particular during replication, with a stability compared only to that of the 1st Legion. This allowed the Ultramarines to steadily grow their ranks, despite the absence of a mature Primarch, to stabilize their gene code. As a As a result, the 13th Legion was able to maintain a relatively high genetic consistency, ensuring that the supplies of new astartes met the excruciating demands for their expanding forces. With their numbers swelling and their reputation for precision and tactics well established, the 13th Legion became a powerful presence within the Great Crusade. At this time, the Emperor, alongside his most trusted commanders, Varus Manus of the 10th and Horus Lupercal of the Luna Wolves, led the primary thrust of the Crusade into the distant reaches of the Segmentum Solar. The Emperor's forces would then venture beyond the borders of humanity's core territories, seeking to expand the Imperium's grasp across the galaxy as a whole. However, due to scale, self-sufficiency, and genetic stability, the 13th Legion, and thereby the 12th Expeditionary Fleet, was entrusted with a critical mission of exploring and consolidating the intergalactic disk, a territory situated between the densely populated core world of Terra, along with the immediately surrounding star systems. It was during this period of exploration and expansion that the Osiris Cluster Rebellion erupted. This crisis unfolded alarmingly close to the Capitoline systems, and it was a secessionist movement that threatened the Imperium's stability at the time within Segmentum Solar. The proximity of the rebellion and its potential disruptive influence on the delicately maintained balance of power led to the swift and total mobilization of the 13th Legion, in particular due to their given location. The Ultramarines were the closest and most available force at hand. As a result, they were tasked with bringing this rebellion to a swift and decisive end. As the tensions mounted in the Osiris cluster, the 13th Legion would engage with their traditional combination of strategic pragmatism and rapid mobilization. However, this way of combat would soon be put to the test within the most critical of engagements, as the Osiris cluster was a strategic grouping of 11 star systems within the Segmentum Solar's second quadrant, which ended up in rebellion in 833 M30, and it seemed completely without warning that the Osiris cluster declared their secession from the Imperium. This was a bold move marked by the seizure of Chartist merchant vessels, attacks on the Imperialist Armada Navy patrols, along with the mysterious disappearance of Imperial agents, which many would presume dead. The rebellious systems, many of which had been technologically advanced at the time of their initial compliance, in the 8th year of the Great Crusade, had once been viewed as a triumph for the Imperium at how successfully they were integrated and started producing for the Imperium as a whole. However, it was now found that these successes were, in essence, a challenge to Imperial authority in the process. The declaration of rebellion was seen as an insult to the 13th Legion and its commander, Gren Vusto, who had at one point played a significant role in the Osiris cluster's original compliance years earlier. Vosto considered the insurrection a personal affront to the Legion's very honor, and he was determined to resolve matters swiftly. Vosto also vowed to bring the traitors to heel, ensuring the Legion's reputation would not be tarnished by these acts of defiance. Vosto's first steps was to quickly respond, capitalizing on the 13th Legion's rapid response capabilities. After receiving initial intelligence reports, Vosto ordered almost the entirety of the 12th Expeditionary Fleet under his command to proceed directly to Septus 12, the halo world of the Osiris cluster. The fleet left behind its slower moving support elements, such as lumbering troop transports and forged ships, and set out with the Legion's combat vessels, fully armed and ready to engage. The fleet's objective was the atmospherically sealed city of Koblast, situated on the night side of Septus 12, which served as both the economic and political capital of the Osiris cluster. The logic behind this rapid strike was simple. A blow against the heart of the rebellion would be delivered before the insurgents could fully consolidate their forces, which potentially could end the conflict before it could even start in full. In essence, Vosto's plan was to cripple the rebellion at its source, ensuring the Imperium's authority was reasserted without delay. The 12th Expeditionary Fleet arrived at the outer reaches of the Septus 12 system rather quickly, and their flagship, the Goliath-class macro battleship Sethland's Thunder, led the charge, its heavy firepower providing sufficient force to overwhelm the system's defense ships. The short engagement was a triumph for the 13th, with no losses of space marine forces. After neutralizing the system's orbital defenses, the fleet moved to engage the planet itself. Vosto's plan was rather simple, and it was based on a decapitation strike, an approach that had proven effective in past engagements, and had been honed in part by the Luna Wolves' expertise in such tactics being added to their own knowledge base. The goal was clear: attack the key governmental and environmental control complexes within the capital, cut off these systems who were essential for the Hive City's survival, and in doing so, Vosto Vosto intended to deliver a blow at the heart of the rebellion while minimizing damage to the planet's infrastructure and population as a whole. The assault was designed not only to cripple the rebels, but to serve as a stark reminder of the futility of opposing the Emperor's will. Vosto strategically built upon detailed intelligence and careful military assessment as he calculated the scale of the rebellion and expected only a modest militia force to oppose the 13th Legion. But as the 13th Legion prepared to execute its plan, a harsh reality began to reveal itself. The assumptions of Vosto and his information were fundamentally flawed. The rebellion was not as disorganized or as weak and ill-equipped as they had anticipated, and the challenge they now faced was greater than any they had foreseen. The invasion of Septus VII proper began with the precision and calculated force typical of the 13th Legion. Their flagship unleashed a devastating barrage bombardment against the protective outer shell of the Hive capital of Kobasset, creating massive breaches. Then, as the bombardment subsided, Lord Commander Gren Vosto, at the helm of the Legion's assault, led the initial charge personally. His Stormbird assault craft descended upon the heart of the Hive city, as the first wave of the Legion's warriors prepared to cut down any resistance. However, what they encountered was far beyond their expectations. The forces on the ground were unlike any typical foe. Instead of disorganized human militia, the 13th Legion found themselves facing waves upon waves of civilians, their eyes hollow and vacant, their movements driven by something far more insidious than mere rebellion. These were dead-eyed individuals forcibly transformed into weapons of war themselves, crude, grotesque mannequins, mockeries of the human form. Many had been hastily sewn and installed within makeshift pressure suits, and carried improvised weapons that realistically would do little damage on their own. However, the most deadly of these were explosive mining charges, adapted into crude self-termination devices. The Legion's initial tactics, rapid, decisive, and brutal, quickly proved ineffective against the seemingly endless tide of bodies being pressed against them. As human waves poured forth in cold, inhuman silence, undeterred by the deadly force that had brought down countless enemies in the past, the situation grew dire. It became painfully clear that the 13th Legion was facing far more than a mere rebellion. This was no ordinary insurgency. It was an enemy with an unyielding will, and the resolve to do something rather unnatural. Vosto, unwilling to allow his forces to be bogged down, called for reinforcements and an adjustment of his tactic. The Legion's superior close-quarter combat training would be the key to their victory, as it would rely on its strength to push forward, along with coordination to counter the overwhelming numbers. Yet despite their superior training and equipment, the advancing legionaries were taking increasing numbers of casualties as they fought their way deeper into the Hive city. They would face oppositions from what could only be described as noble bodyguards, warriors who had been part of the city's elite but were now reduced to mindless automatons of human flesh, driven forward by an unknown force. Their ranks thin, but their movements and armaments were both cold and unflinching. As the Legion continued to push further and further, the sheer scale of the resistance became clear. The deeper they advanced, the more entrenched the enemy became, and the less human they would be. And what was originally planned to be a surgical strike now seemed destined for a catastrophe. Suddenly, and without warning, a Xenos fleet of unknown origin emerged from the embrace of Septus XII's giant star. Comprising of 5 hourglass-shaped vessels, their structures rotated ceaselessly, turning like clockwork. The appearance of this fleet sent shockwaves through the Legion's command. What had been an attempted surgical strike was now at risk of being overwhelmed by a force far more sophisticated and more ruthless than they had expected. Realizing said peril, Vosto ordered a general retreat from the surface. However, as his forces began to withdraw their Stormbirds and transports, the nature of the conflict began to shift once more. The attack on the 13th Legion intensified further still. The assault was rather different, now far more coordinated and deliberate. It was clear that they were not just facing a rebellious force, but a convergent enemy, both known and unknown, closing in around them on all sides. These disgusting Xenos were using humans as tools, committing heavy casualties to the Ultramarines, and great atrocities to humanity as a whole. The situation had now turned into a battle for survival, rather than an employment of tactics. As the battle raged on, the 13th Legion found itself facing overwhelming odds. Their Stormbirds, essential for extracting their legions from the Hive cities, came under constant assaults, some of them being taken down from the air just as they took off, all the while being hounded by the torrents of civilian, zombie-like mobs, seemingly endless as they poured from side junctions, corridors, and even sewer tunnels within Hive Koblast. Their purpose was not to kill, but it was to pin down and trap the Astartes. These civilians, inhumanly unflinching in their sacrifice, sought only to overwhelm the legionaries, using their sheer mass to neutralize the Astartes' superior physical and tactical prowess. Meanwhile, high above the surface, the Xenos fleet itself clashed violently with the 12th Expeditionary Fleet. The battle unfolded in a fierce, ranged engagement as two forces exchanged blows in a contest of power. The hourglass-shaped vessels, vastly superior in size and power to the Imperial flagship XIII's Thunder, retaliated with devastating uses of energy weapons. These strange craft lashed out with elemental particle whips. The 12th Expeditionary Fleet was outmatched but still holding strong, fought back valiantly, to the point that one of the immense Xenos vessels was forced to fall back, its hull ruptured, and strange glowing vapors spilling out from the wound. Despite this, the cost was high, as the Imperial Fleet lost dozens of its own warships. Their flagship, the XIII's Thunder, also was grievously damaged and now burning, spiraling out of control, leaving the Legion to face an increasingly perilous situation. As the battles in the sky intensified, a new horror emerged. Figures, pale and aglow with a sickly light, materialized amongst the chaos of both the surface and within the warships above. These were not mere warriors, but something far more sinister. Armored in biomechanical containment suits, these ghastly entities were barely corporeal, existing as ghastly glowing mists, their gauntlets unleashing ethereal fire, and their alien wills probed the minds of the legionaries, seeking to crush any resistance. In the midst of this chaos, Commander Vosto made his final command, a full withdrawal of his forces, the priority being the retrieval of as many surviving legionaries as possible. This grim order came at a heavy cost. With his forces shattered and in retreat, Vosto chose to remain on the surface, making the ultimate sacrifice as he commanded the rearguard. This act was one of penance, a final attempt to atone for the tactical errors that had led them to this situation. His last act before his death was transferring command of the 13th Legion to First Master Marnius Gage, the most senior surviving officer in orbit. Gage's quick thinking and tactical brilliance would end up proving critical, as he led a desperate high-stakes battle in the void, conducting a series of counter-thrusts, feints, and strategic retreats, keeping the Xenos fleet at bay just long enough for the remaining Stormbirds to escape. Gage's successful leadership held the Xenos Titan ships at arm's length, allowing the 12th Expeditionary Fleet to disengage and begin its escape. It was through Gage's sheer determination and the tactical acumen of the 13th Legion that they were able to survive without incurring further immense costs. In the wake of the Orisis Cluster Rebellion and the catastrophic defeat at Septus 12, the word of this new enemy was to be delivered to Terra at all costs. The 13th Legion had encountered a force unlike any they had ever faced before, one that would become a terrifying chapter in the Imperium's history. The events would mark the beginning of a new and unknown threat to the Imperium being countered. When the smoke cleared and the casualty reports were compiled in the aftermath of the Battle of Septus 12, it was nothing short of catastrophic. What had initially threatened to become a complete disaster was, by some measure, reduced to a mere defeat, though the losses were staggering. The Legion suffered the greatest single loss in their history as of yet, with over 6,500 Space Marines perishing, which was approximately a fifth of their Legion's fighting force. This tragic tally included some of their most elite members, in particular Terran veterans who had fought alongside the Emperor during the early stages of the Great Crusade, along with their Lord Commander Gren Vosto, whose death struck a devastating blow to the leadership and the morale of the Legion. The 12th Expeditionary Fleet fared no better. A quarter of its warships lost, as they were either destroyed or left in such an irreparably damaged state that they had to be scuttled. The pride of the fleet, XIII's Thunder, had been reduced to a wreck, and the toll on the Imperial forces was immense. Beyond physical losses, however, there was a deeper wound made to the 13th's honor. The overconfidence that had led them to such a perilous position haunted them deeply. The Legion, once a symbol of near invincibility, had been humbled. Though they longed for revenge, their opportunity for retribution was cruelly denied. Despite this, the 13th Legion regrouped. Just under a standard year later, they returned to the Osiris cluster with reinforcements, including elements of the Solar Armada and the 18th Legion, the Salamanders, along with specialist anti-psyker cadres from Terra, which are assumed to include Sisters of Silence. Just under a standard year later, the hope was that they could confront this elusive enemy, now known as the Osirian Cybrid, and eradicate the threat that had so grievously wounded them and humanity. But what they found upon their return was far from what they anticipated. The Osirian Cybrids were nowhere to be found. The Xenos elites that had so decisively turned the tide of battle against them had vanished without a trace. Instead, Imperial forces would encounter a devastated Osiris cluster, one that had been terraformed into a landscape of ruin. The planets within the cluster had been reduced reduced to wastelands, littered with unburied bodies, and what few remained were embroiled in unending civil strife and chaos. It became clear that the Xenos invaders had been more subtle in their campaigns than anyone had anticipated. What records were left behind, fragmentary and scattered, were often corrupted beyond recognition, providing very little clarity. Some planetary dataspheres remained, but they too had been purged, their contents erased or altered to prevent any coherent understanding of the invaders' origins. The only consistent detail was that the Osiris cybrids had often infiltrated the cluster with an unnatural precision. Initially, they had operated covertly, moving in the shadows and taking control of entire worlds, piecemeal. Their tactics were rather insidious, as they broke the will of their populations, either by subjugating their minds through psychic manipulation or kidnapping entire segments of the population and refitting their biology to better suit their needs, leaving the remaining survivors as a state of utter peril and silent neglect, either through starvation, despair, or biological inactivity. Wherever the Xenos had gone and what had become of their armies was a question that remained unanswered. What remained, however, was the haunting reality that the 13th and the Imperium was left with far more questions than answers. The Osiris cybrids, a force the Legion and many Imperial generals had once feared, had just disappeared as quickly as they had arrived, leaving behind only the scars of their presence. The Imperium, as it stood, was none the wiser of the full scale of the threat they had actually faced, and the possibility of future encounters with this mysterious force would hang in the air. In the wake of the failed campaign, a horrifying truth had emerged for the 13th Legion. The foe they had encountered was not just powerful, but capable of subtly twisting and manipulating entire worlds simultaneously from within the shadows. These invaders employed covert psychic domination in order to twist and turn worlds into hotbeds of rebellion and strife. They preyed on the fears of rulers and exploited the psychological vulnerabilities of entire populations simultaneously. The discovery of such a threat was made worse as it was not just an army of overwhelming numbers, but a clear and present danger, one who could manipulate and use insidious tactics to strike at the very heart of the Imperium itself. The Emperor, in all his wisdom, had declared this force to be a threat to be eliminated and exterminated by any means, and the 13th Legion was now burning with a blood oath of vengeance that they would not rest until every last trace of this enemy was erased from existence. The reclamation of the Osiris cluster, though it had returned to Imperial control, was far from a victory. The cluster was now marked by devastation. What remained was no glory, but a grim process of repopulation and restoration. For the 13th Legion, the campaign had ended not with honor, but with a hard, cold truth. The Legion's astartes had been bested by an enemy that had never been fully understood. The Legion's shattered remains returned to the Imperium's fold, and the weight of their losses settled heavily upon their hearts. Under the leadership of Marneus Gage, who had assumed the mantle of Lord Commander and Legion Master of the 13th, began an audacious task of rebuilding. Supply lines and supplies themselves were replenished, the ranks refilled, and an air of grim, dogged determination began to settle. However, there was no escaping the shadow of Septis XII. The names of those lost in battle, including their former Lord Commander, Grenvosto, were now whispered in cries of vengeance, one that they would have to use to wash away the stain of defeat by fully erasing the species from existence. As the months turned into years, the Legion's focus shifted. Their once fervent desire for recognition and respect from their peers would become quiet determination. The 13th Legion no longer sought accolades, but only to prove themselves that the humiliation of Septis XII had been a singular aberration, a fluke, a mistake that would never be repeated and would never define them again. But the truth was, something deeper was at play. The feeling of loss and doubt had taken root within the Legion's ranks. There was also the fact that in the hearts of every astartes was the biological and spiritual need to reunite with their Primarch. And as this urge grew within the 13th Legion, what was once an occasional longing would turn into an obsession. The need for their Primarch, along with Grenvosto's death, had left a hollow void within the Legion, and no victory would truly heal it. Their desire for reunion was no longer just a matter of honor. It was seen as the only way to restore their worthiness and regain some semblance of self. What they did not know, however, was that more than 2 Terran years earlier, the Emperor had already found their Primarch, the one they had longed for, and the one who they thought might be forever lost. However, unfortunately for them, the warp was a fickle mistress. As it often was, it had thwarted the direct efforts of their contact. Their Primarch's return and the Legion's salvation had been delayed for many more standard years than it would have otherwise, leaving the Legion to carry on without him, their spirits torn between hope and desperation. For the moment, the Legion was trapped in a time of both turmoil and unending purpose. Each battle they fought in the name of the Great Crusade was tainted by a deep sense of emptiness, which would lead them to another battle and another battle. As the Legion moved from one world to the next, each conquest a step towards something, though what exactly that something was, no one could say. The 13th Legion's future now lay entwined with the potential return of the Primarch, a reunion that when it came promised to either restore them or break them completely. Until then, they would continue to fight and fight again, in order to make the loss at Septus 12 merely a step towards redemption. The early days of mankind's expansion beyond Terra were defined by numerous campaigns that would shape the future of the Imperium for far longer than they realistically should. Amongst these was the first pacification of Luna, which occurred in 703 M30, and it stands as one of the earliest and most significant actions undertaken by the fledgling Imperium. And it marked the first time that elements of the Space Marine legions, part of the Emperor's Great Crusade, fought beyond the skies of Terra itself. It was a better time for the 13th Legion, as the time of the Unification Wars was still raging across the surface of Terra. And Luna, mankind's closest celestial body, was a home of a collection of gene cults known as the Selenar. These cults were the product of ancient and mysterious resurrectionist technologies, which had been used to cultivate the belief that human nature was fractal and ultimately transcendent. Each Selenar faction sought to distill the perfect singular archetype for humanity, and through their clandestine genetic manipulations, the cults would undergo significant structures of repeated resurrection. Their adherence to these superstitious beliefs was steeped in the ancient technology of the Dark Ages, and it led them to resist the Emperor's calls for submission and the implementation of the imperial truth. Despite the repeated attempts by the Emperor to forge an alliance, these Selenar cults responded with silence and/or violence, and the Imperium's threats continued to mount. And so, to reunite Luna with the Imperium, the Emperor created a task force of 3 newly formed legions: the 7th Legion, known as the Imperial Fists, the 13th Legion, known as the Ultramarines, and the newly christened 16th Legion, which would eventually become known as the Luna Wolves, would be assigned to bring Luna into compliance. And those who would become the Luna Wolves were chosen as a vanguard to silently ascend into the void within an assault craft in a manner that the Selenar would be left unawares of their imminent assault, as any preparation would do little as the Luna Wolves craft struck decisively, and within 6 solar hours, Luna had been pacified, making it the first off-world conquest of the newborn Imperium, in particular one where the Ultramarines would also take part. In the wake of this attack, the remaining Selenar cultists, facing annihilation, surrendered to the Emperor. In a communication, they famously requested the Emperor call off his wolves, which included the Imperial Fists, the Luna Wolves, and the Ultramarines, and it signaled the end of their resistance. The surviving gene craftsmen were subsequently enslaved and/or pressed into service depending on their crimes, all for the Emperor's grand design. This would be one of the first times that the Ultramarines and the Luna Wolves would work together, and after their swift victory, they would go on to work together constantly during the Great Crusade. And this would all culminate with the greatest change that came to the 13th Legion when they were reunited with their Primarch.